Oh, no, you didn't go to Haspel. But anyway, can you broadly
I can just
characterize
make,
what they said?
I'll just make one comment.
Okay, that's fine.
I think, I walk out of there with the impression that I personally think that we should be doing more with regard to Jamal Khashoggi. It doesn't seem like we're really putting the screws to the Saudi leadership with regard to his murder. And so I walk out with the impression that we just need to do a lot more at this point. With regard to Yemen, just a terrible humanitarian crisis. I'm glad there's a political process underway, and I hope that our leadership can really pressure the parties to a successful conclusion. In the meantime, the people that are suffering have to be helped, and so we have to do whatever we can to use our leverage to help them. Thank you. Thank you. I'm sorry.
We're not here to satisfy your belief in what we need to do.
I didn't hear a whole lot new from what is already in the public domain. Thank you. Thank you.
Did they discuss? Secretary Pompeo.
So do other people. It was in Cuba they shut it down. Because Cuba has weapons.
I thought today's briefing was good. There's still some unanswered questions, of course. But I thought bottom line, they made although I won't go into a lot of what was said in the briefing, they made the point very strongly of the importance of our relationship with Saudi Arabia, and also understanding that we can stand for values and rights at the same time, and also understanding the consequences of abandoning the fight in Yemen. You look at the humanitarian crisis in Yemen today, and it wasn't started by the Saudi air campaign. It was started by the Houthi rebels and access and denial of access for food, overthrowing a legitimate government. And I thought it was a good briefing all in all. Thanks.
Anywhere except in the gym for a while, so it's good to see you down here.
Yes, indeed.
Getting some work from.
Yes.
Did Secretary Pompeo stick with his instructions from when he briefed the Senate that Mohammed Saleh had no connection to this, nothing to do with this?
Well, both Secretary Pompeo and General Mattis went into some detail about this ongoing investigation, the concern that we all have about what happened with Khashoggi. We also talked about the complexities of the relationship with some of our allies in trying to end the civil war in Yemen. And, you know, there's been an ongoing civil war. The United States has been involved with a number of other countries in trying to use diplomacy to end that. And there's also an involvement with Al-Qaeda that has been an ongoing operation with the United States. But of course, a lot of this information was classified. We got into some good conversation about what is involved in trying to help end the conflict in Yemen.
Will the House move anything by the end of the year?
You know, a lot of members have had discussions about really not just what's going on in Yemen. Some of this goes back to the AUMF. So a lot of members have had conversations about it. There were a lot of good questions that members asked and got answers to in a classified setting. And so, you know, maybe that addresses some of the questions that are ongoing. And, you know, a lot of these issues are not just about what's happening in Yemen. So we're going to continue to have this
Would you
debate.
should be willing to put on the floor a resolution condemning Saudi Arabia for the Khashoggi murder?
Well, I'm not sure about, you know, what other members might file in terms of legislation.
Would you support
but
that? Would leadership
obviously,
be supportive?
there is an ongoing investigation that we're very interested in seeing the outcome of and holding the people accountable for what happened with Khashoggi. There needs to be action. There have already been sanctions against individuals who have been found responsible, and there's additional investigations that are ongoing that need to occur, and ultimately we need to hold everybody accountable.
Is it an impression right now that, sorry. They're in the Constitution. There's three.
Drove and found.
Senator? Any comments?
Huh?
Any comments? How did it go in there today? Anything you can share with us?
No, I don't think so. It's just a very complicated situation. I think it's the best way to address it.
Did you hear anything to side you, how to go about it, or what America should be doing in this situation with Yemen and the Crown Prince? Can you step up?
Not as yet. No, not as yet. Not as yet.
Any words? Any comments? Any words? Can you share anything with us? What happened in there? Everybody's coming out and everybody's coming out and they don't have much to say.
But not much was shared. I think we are permitted to tell you that once again we did not hear from a briefing from the CIA director, which I think many of us had hoped for. But we didn't, at least in my view, learn anything new. Serious questions remain about America's engagement in Yemen and an absence of congressional authorization for that engagement, the unwillingness of the administration to support a full debate on that in Congress, and persistent questions remain about the role of the Crown Prince in the brutal murder of a journalist living in this country who was dismembered in the council. Our relationship with the Saudis may be important, but we also have an important role to demonstrate America's moral leadership in the world. And we benefit from democracy and a free press and promoting those values around the world. And to see the President of the United States and the Secretary of State of our country ambivalently dismiss the potential actions of the Crown Prince in directing or being aware of this brutal murder is gravely disappointing and betrays American values and, frankly, betrays America's national security interests around the world, because we benefit from stable, prosperous, democratic governments around the world. Those responsible for this need to be held accountable. We need to hear from the CIA director. Today's briefing, sadly, was a colossal waste of time.
So what do you think the House needs to do about all this?
Go ahead.
I'll defer to Mr. Delegate.
We came within just a few votes yesterday of stopping the attempt to block our War Powers resolution from being considered. I'm Lloyd Doggett from Texas. This administration is pursuing a disgraceful policy with reference to the Khashoggi murder and the many murders that are occurring in Yemen. And all we had here today was more disgraceful ducking and dodging by the Secretary. I could have spent the time watching the cable news and learned more.
Let me note that this administration did not create this problem. It has inherited whatever is going on right now in Saudi Arabia was inherited by this president with the type of brutality that was reflected in Saudi Arabia's former support for terrorism. Terrorists that killed Americans was something we could not tolerate, and this president made it very clear that if Saudi Arabia wants to be a friend of the United States, that it must drive its terrorists out of the mosque. I am very supportive of our president in that regard, and I would think that what we heard in there today is what we must say, that Saudi Arabia is not perfect, but we do not want to make sure that it goes back to the days before the current Crown Prince took power, where they were supporting terrorists and people who were killing Americans. So with that in mind, we must not just throw the baby out with the bathwater, but realize that perhaps this new crown prince is trying to take Saudi Arabia in a better direction than it was when it supported terrorism just a few years ago.
Is that Pompeo?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm gonna go back. So what are you doing now?
I'm done with this. Pelosi's got a press conference.
Yes. 10:45.
10:45? Okay.
I was looking at it. But I'll follow it from the.
Okay. Yeah, I'll do that.
I think I'll follow it from my desk because I want to prepare for the Yemen.
Okay, I guess it's all. See you later.
See you later. Bye.
I don't know. You guys want to comment from? Okay. Well. Hello, I'm Brad Sherman from California. I'm the second-ranking Democrat on the Foreign Affairs Committee. We've just been briefed on both the murder of Mr. Khashoggi and on our policy toward Yemen. It's clear that Congress wants to respond to the murder of Jamal Khashoggi and that the response we've made so far is not sufficient. Two members of the President's cabinet argued that that should not be a reason in and of itself to change our policy toward Yemen. I raised the issue of another way to respond, and that is to make sure that Saudi Arabia does not develop a nuclear weapon. I have a bill that I will be dropping next week to say that we cannot have a nuclear cooperation agreement with Saudi Arabia that does not meet the gold standard for non-proliferation. I believe that if we cannot trust the Saudis with a bone saw, we cannot trust them with a nuclear weapons program. And I think this offers us a way to respond to the murder of Khashoggi by doing something that everyone agrees is our national interest, and that is to push the Saudis toward a gold standard for non-proliferation. I don't know if anybody has any questions.
Apologies if I missed this. I came up a bit late, but do you think Democrats next year need to be pushing another Yemen war powers resolution or sanctions against MBS or anything like that?
What the point I was making is our policy toward Yemen. Okay, yes. We need to craft a policy toward Yemen based on what's happening in Yemen, and Democrats will be very involved in that both next week and next year. But if the effort here is to deal with the death of and the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, we ought to be looking at the Saudi nuclear weapons program, something we should be looking at anyway. It is whether a change in our Yemen policy is in the interests of the people of Yemen and the people of the United States is something Democrats will certainly analyze. But it is undoubtedly in our interest to make sure that if Saudi Arabia has a nuclear energy program, that it is subject to the gold standard. That means no reprocessing, no enrichment, and the intrusive inspections required by the additional protocol regardless of what we do in Yemen, if we allow Saudi Arabia to use a supposedly peaceful energy generation program as cover to develop a nuclear weapon, we've made a mistake.
Do you additionally believe there should be steps taken to pull back U.S. support for the Saudi-led effort in Yemen?
We have a lot to analyze as to what happened in Sweden. I'd point out that the Saudis have made an awful lot of mistakes in Yemen, but the Houthis seem to be more or less on the same page with the Assad regime, and that is to say they're both supported by Tehran. And I'm not sure that abandoning the Yemeni people to the Houthis would result in fewer deaths than we've seen so far. So the answer is we need to analyze our policies, and whatever our analysis was yesterday needs to be redone tomorrow in light of what happened in Sweden today.
But there's a resolution on the floor in the Senate today, and it might have been on the floor in the House had that rule not blocked it yesterday. Would you have voted no at this time?
I have to keep up with the things I need to vote on. I get a memo before I vote. The memo I got yesterday is this is something I will not be voting on, so I haven't read the memo. I have not analyzed, I have a hard enough time voting on everything I have to vote on in the House. If I have to vote on I don't know how I would vote if I was a senator. My state hasn't given me that responsibility. And I might very well support it. I just haven't, You've caught me on the fly here and asked me about a bill that is not coming to the House of Representatives. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Elliot Engel of New York. I am the next chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and I listened intently to what was said and have spoken with a number of people. The relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia is a very important relationship. But obviously there are some troubling things. Obviously the killing of Khashoggi is something that we just cannot let go. It's absolutely abhorrent. I think that we need to check our relationship with Saudi Arabia, with the Saudis, and make it very clear that we are not comfortable with a lot of things apparently that are happening at the highest levels in Saudi Arabia. The war in Yemen is a big sticking point for many people, many members of Congress. The fact that there's a humanitarian crisis there and that bombs are being dropped on buses with school children and possible continued starvation and other atrocities. That's not something that we can countenance, that we can just look the other way and say, well, it's part of war. When we have a relationship with a country, and I in no way am advocating that we break our relationship with Saudi Arabia, because we have interests that cross and are very important, but I think it's up for the United States to be able to tell our allies when we think things have gone astray. And clearly in Yemen, things have gone astray. So the House Foreign Affairs Committee and the new Congress is going to delve into all these issues concerning the U.S.-Saudi relationship, Yemen, and everything else. You know, the Saudis, in my opinion, were right to worry about the Houthis. The Houthis are a terrorist group. They are in compliance with Iran, working with Iran, and Iran has been very aggressive, and we cannot turn a blind eye to it. On the other hand, we cannot use it as an excuse to just say whatever the Saudi government is doing is okay because we're fighting for the greater cause. So I think it's a time to pause and to check on our relationship with Saudi Arabia. It really needs to be a two-way street. I'm not advocating breaking the relationship, but I am advocating to say that it cannot simply be business as usual. And the United States, I think, has to stand very, very firmly on the side of civil rights, on the side of preventing famine and catastrophe from happening in Yemen. I think that's very, very important.
Does that mean taking actions like are being talked about in the Senate now about, stopping the arms transfers and things like that, or is it just statements? I mean, when you're talking about not letting the status quo perpetuate and has to stand firmly, what do you mean?
We are going to hold hearings on all aspects of U.S.-Saudi policies, including armaments, and we will leave no stone unturned. But we're going to be very thorough about it.
Do you think that the Crown Prince should be sanctioned for his alleged involvement in the Khashoggi murder?
That who should be?
The Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia.
Well, I can't mention some of the things that they have told us yesterday and today, but I do think that this horrific killing of this journalist is not something that we can just simply look the other way and say, hey, what are you going to do? This is war and these things happen. These things shouldn't happen, and we have to be very pointed about it.
So is there a specific... Is the Crown Prince, should he be held responsible? I mean, the senators across the Capitol have been receiving the same level of classified briefings, and they are putting resolutions on the floor and saying unequivocally yes. And members in the House haven't heard that.
Well,
yet.
the Crown Prince, of course, is the heir to the throne, so to speak, and the king and his people need to be held responsible. Yes, I think that things are still coming out in terms of how it was done and who did it. Yes, they have to be held responsible.
Can you give some sense of the reaction in the room to Secretary Mattis and to Secretary Pompeo? Last week, after the Haspel briefing, a bunch of senators, including Republican ones, said that they felt that Pompeo had been misleading and Mattis had been misleading. Did you feel that they were misleading today? You've had some combative hearings with Secretary Pompeo. What was what was the sense in the room with these two people that, of course, at least with Pompeo, you've had some difficult back and forth with?
Well, I went up to Secretary Pompeo at the end of the briefing, and when everybody was leaving, and asked him to come to the Foreign Affairs Committee as early as possible in January, if that's possible. And he gave me a commitment that he would do that. So we're going to ask him and others to come forth. And as I've said before, we're going to look at all aspects of U.S.-Saudi policy. I have no ulterior motives. I don't think that down the line I have come to a conclusion, but I think that it's very disheartening to see these kinds of things happening, not only to journalists, especially to journalists, but to anybody, and it makes it very hard. And you know, you just scratch your head and you say, what were they thinking? What were they thinking? Thank you.
Thank you.
Congressman, did
Yeah.
Mattis and Pompeo still maintain the notion that there's no direct evidence, and in their briefing today differ from what you had in Haspel yesterday?
Sure. I'm gonna go to that. Do that.